I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army stationed at Fort Etzing, on the verge of discharge, when President Bush ordered the troop surge into Iraq in 2003. I'd just made it back home to Austin, Texas, when I got a call up from my local National Guard unit at Camp Muri. They told me I was about to be recalled to active duty, but the unit had already been tasked with deploying to Iraq. Since I wasn't officially part of that unit yet, the commander offered me an exemption, a chance to deploy instead with a government contractor, Talon, based out of Houston. I knew I'd make a lot more money as a contractor, so I took the gig. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Toha, I started working with a team monitoring logistics issues. Our job was to oversee daily supply convoys running between the U.S. base and Baghdad, a route plagued by IED incidents, small arms, firefights, and constant breakdowns of both military and civilian vehicles. Back when I was active duty, I'd been a sharpshooter, or SA, in the 1st Infantry Division, and technically I was still in the Guard, so I often found myself riding along with the convoys. I manned vehicle-mounted weapons, escorting mostly civilian trucks on these runs. During those trips, we had a couple of bizarre encounters in an area south of Baghdad known back then as Camp Babylon. It was originally occupied by French forces but later designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons. Camp Babylon sat in a region believed to be the original home of the famous Tower of Babel. There were actual ruins there, massive remnants that looked like they once belonged to some colossal structure. I ran into 2 strange incidents while passing through that place. The first one seemed a bit off, but set the stage for the second, which was even weirder. We were rolling through Camp Babylon one afternoon when our convoy came under small arms fire. The SOP, standard operating procedure at the time, was to halt the convoy and return fire. In the past, incidents like that often ended with a lone gunman trying to spook the convoy into speeding up and hitting an IED planted on the road. So, the SOP had shifted. Stop, engage, and let the engineers sweep for explosives. We scanned. The horizon for hostiles, nothing. They must have bolted right away. But the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadowy figures that seemed to dart around the area. We'd spot them multiple times, only for them to vanish instantly. A contractor riding next to me, Marcus, with his weapon at the ready, muttered how eerie it was that we were in the shadow of Babel, fighting supernatural forces. I didn't respond, but I knew he was a 32nd degree Mason who loved the mystical lore of Babylon and all that jazz. I didn't feel much supernatural vibes at the time, but I definitely saw those faint, fleeting shadows scurrying around the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we pressed on to Baghdad. The second incident happened about a month later. By then, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned pretty chilly at night. On this run, we'd just finished a supply drop in Baghdad and were heading back to Camp Toha in Kuwait when one of the vehicles in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the Army mechanics checked the truck, the rest of us took up defensive positions around the area. That's when things got weird. It started with a strange flickering light out in the desert. I thought it was someone with a flashlight. We used NVG's night vision goggles to scope it out, but it was just a glowing orb drifting toward a pile of rubble. After that first glimpse of the light, a few of us moved forward, away from the convoy to figure out what it was. When we realized it wasn't a person, just floating on its own, we got a little spooked. Then we heard a sound I'll never forget. A long, mournful wail rising from one of the ruined foundations not far off. It sounded like a woman in agony, mixed with loneliness. The cries kept going while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were hearing. With NVGs on, We swept flashlights over the ruins. If you've ever done that, you know a regular flashlight through night vision looks like a massive beam. We searched the area, but there was no source for the wail or that glowing orb. Around that time, the radio crackled with word that the truck was fixed and ready to roll, so we decided to head back to the convoy. I was slinging my saw, squad automatic weapon, over my shoulder when I noticed Marcus staring at the ruins in absolute terror. He was frozen stiff. I shook him, snapped him out of it, and we hightailed it back to the vehicles with the rest of the crew. When we got back to camp, it was clear and bright the next morning. A few of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily ops briefing. That's when I remembered the horrified look on Marcus's face, so I asked him about it. He was still shaken up but tried to explain. He said that as we were pulling back from our spot on that sandy hill, he'd seen a tall, dark figure standing by the ruins, watching us while we searched. He said a wave of despair hit him instantly, and he thought he was going to die. He didn't even remember leaving the area. His next memory was being in the Humvee heading back to Kuwait. I'm working on a non-fiction book about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishers now, and I've visited hundreds of so-called haunted sites, but I'll never forget that wailing in the ruins of Babel. What's wild is that when I told this story to some of the crew at Camp Toha and Camp Afran, they were floored too. One of them, an interpreter we called Tariq, said we'd run into a jinn, or a cursed spirit, and we were damn lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agreed with him. Back in the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan with my family. My dad thought seeing the world would be an adventure that'd shape my brother and me into better men, and I've got to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures most folks never get to experience, and I'm grateful for every moment life's thrown my way, even the creepy ones. When we lived in Japan, Dad wanted us to dive headfirst into the culture, so he moved us into a little Japanese neighborhood just outside the base. He rented a small house perched on top of a hill at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. I'm not kidding when I say it overlooked part of a huge zoo on one side and a massive cemetery on the other. Our house sat higher up than the monkey habitat, about a mile downhill from us, and that habitat was like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. A thick, tangled jungle. The neighborhood kids and I would trek through it endlessly, ignoring the locals' warnings about venomous snakes and old World War II relics. We were the only American family in that cul-de-sac, surrounded entirely by Japanese families, and it was awesome. The kids loved us, and even though we couldn't speak the language well, we got each other just fine most of the time. Across from us lived an older couple with a lush garden that ran the length of their property. The woman insisted we call her Obasan, and she'd rope us into helping with her gardening whenever she could lure us over with green tea, chocolate cookies, or bananas. We adored her. She was warm, welcoming, and generous, just like everyone else there. It was a fantastic neighborhood. The only downside to Obasan's place was that it faced straight out onto the cemetery, and that graveyard wasn't like any I'd seen before. Since Okinawa's an island, burials weren't common. Instead, they built crypts above ground. A lot of the cemeteries were carved into the hillsides that make up the island. These big crypts were made of polished stone arches, set on wide square bases with a slot in the middle where they'd slide the coffin in. Once it was inside, they'd seal it with another polished stone slab, leaving a little ledge on the outside for offerings to loved ones who'd passed. Food, incense, that sort of thing. Below Obasan's house, a valley dipped down to another hill. That valley and both hillsides were covered with those crypts. Winding up and down through them were old stone stairways, crumbling and poorly maintained. It was an incredible sight. One evening, Obasan asked me to come visit her alone. She had something to show me, but it was just for me, not my brother. Curious and a little proud, I agreed. She led me out to her backyard and sat me down on a thick wooden bench carved with images of fishermen and men holding swords. She said she had a story to tell me. Then she disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a tray of hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Setting it beside me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun started to dip. Obasan said she'd seen me, my brother, and some of the other kids daring each other to walk down the cemetery stairs. You've got to understand, the path from our little neighborhood down to the graveyard was hundreds of steps, many of them broken or cracked, overgrown with brush, and steep as hell. It'd be risky for anyone. But the real challenge was seeing how long we could wander through the crypts at night. Obasan wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Years ago, during the war, Americans were painted as devilish monsters who'd slaughter innocent people for no reason other than to kill. It was wartime propaganda, meant to rally young men into the military and get farmers to fight alongside them. But plenty didn't. A lot of folks ran, with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Hundreds of Japanese civilians took their own lives, jumping off cliffs rather than face torture from the enemy they'd been taught to fear. I was terrified hearing this. I didn't know it had happened. I felt ashamed and sad. I started crying. The sun was setting, and the sky shifted from pink and blue to deep orange and red. Obasan reached out, took my hand, and told me not to worry. It was the past, she said, and the past is something we have to remember so we never go back. She kept going with her story. A young woman had made that sacrifice with her 2 kids, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she woke up, she was horrified to realize she wasn't with her children. They'd been buried somewhere in the cemetery below, in an unmarked mass crypt with so many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching through the graveyard, crying out in tormented grief. Her loss was unbearable until one day she threw herself into the sea, hoping to escape and maybe reunite with her lost family. But they say she never found her kids. Her suicide condemned her to purgatory, cursed to suffer forever. The sun was gone by then, and the cemetery was swallowed in pitch-black darkness. The main path was dotted with faint, weak lanterns lighting up small patches. Obasan kept going. She said the woman still wanders the graveyard searching for her children. You can hear her crying, she said, and then she pointed down. I didn't want to look, but I did. In the darkness at the back of the cemetery, there was a white figure. At first, just a shimmering glow, moving slowly, trembling, a little. It swayed side to side like it was weaving between the crypts. At first you could barely hear it, a soft sob, but then it grew into a low, anguished moan and whispers of pain as it got closer. I was scared out of my mind. I wanted to run, but Obasan held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far away. But that's why we shouldn't go down there after dark, she said. She told me lots of folks don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which makes her angry. Best to stay away, she said. Best to pray for her. Obasan said she visits her sometimes, hoping one day she'll find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went back to that cemetery. Not once. And I never sat out there with Obasan again either. That was enough for me. Later I did visit Cape Esward, what they call the Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all those souls and for forgiveness. A bunch of Japanese folks talked to us, welcomed us, shared their stories with us. I felt unworthy of their kindness. The love I have for that country and Its people is overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I want to go back someday, see if she's still out there, if her kids' graves have been found. I bought my first house in 2003, right after I got back from Iraq, and it felt like a dream come true. I'd settled in Austin, Texas, ready to start fresh. But not long after moving in, two of my neighbors started teasing me about the ghost in my place. I figured they were just messing around, so I played along, acting like I'd seen something and it wasn't a big deal. That summer rolled by, and I kept meeting more folks in the neighborhood. Weirdly, they all brought up the same thing. Finally, an older lady down the block, real sweet and friendly, sat me down and told me the story after I asked her straight up. I knew she wouldn't spin me some wild tale just to mess with my head, which is why I went to her in the first place. Turns out the previous owner had bought the house but never lived in it. She'd said it was haunted. Strange noises at night like footsteps and sobbing, and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbors, a guy named Darius who'd helped me fix up the place, told me he was putting up drywall one day when he felt something lift the braids off his neck. I'd had my share of eerie experiences years back, so I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to nightmares or my imagination. Then one day I went to this little video store in the neighborhood to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my info, basic stuff like demographics and my credit card details. The owner, a woman named Nadine, glanced at it and went, "Oh, wow, you live in that house?" I asked what she meant, and she laid it out for me. She said one of her old employees had offed himself in my house. She'd gone over there right after she heard, but the place was already taped off by the cops as a potential crime scene. According to her, it went down in the early 90s. The guy had just moved in with his partner and called his mom to invite her over to meet him, wanted to break the news. Back then, being gay was a huge deal. His mom already knew he was gay since he'd bought the house with another man, and she tore into him over the phone. That same week, he got a letter from an HIV testing center saying he'd tested positive. This was when HIV was a death sentence. So he sat down at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a handgun. Ever since. Then Nadine said she'd had weird stuff happen at her shop too. Videos flying off the shelves, even hovering in midair sometimes. The most I ever noticed at my place were noises at night. The sound of cereal pouring into a bowl. I don't even eat cereal. And sobbing coming from the kitchen. I'd wake up to both those sounds pretty often. I remembered my grandma once telling me that when the dead come to you, they want something. She said to do an act of charity in their name and pray for them. So that's what I did. One night I sat down at the kitchen table, lit a candle, and told him I'd say a 9-day prayer for him. Every night, I'd light a candle and pray before bed. The first night, I prayed to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of lost souls. I heard uncontrollable sobbing, like this overwhelming presence of grief and despair, and a gasping sound, like someone couldn't catch their breath. I sat there with it, feeling it all. I knew it wasn't malicious, just this deep connection of pain and compassion he needed. For 45 days I kept up the 9-day prayers, lighting a candle each time and praying in his name. A few times I'd wake up and feel him standing over my bed, but I could tell it wasn't anything evil. It still happens every now and then, but it's gotten less frequent over time. Here's a story my mom wouldn't tell me until I was 30. So let me start by saying I love writing, which means this'll be a long one, but hopefully a good read. I'll admit up front that I have zero memory of this myself. I was just over 2 years old and barely walking when it happened. Mom only told me about it 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. She grew up in a tiny, strict Christian community in southern Ohio that didn't buy into anything spooky. She believed our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something. Like that. No ghosts, no haunted houses. Nothing. Even after more than 30 years, she looked scared telling me this. The woman who's always loud as hell was practically whispering by the end, her face white as a sheet. I totally believe her, still do. Mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad I don't remember it either. In 1988, my parents had their second kid, my brother Milo. We were crammed into a rented apartment with two little ones, so they decided to move us to an old, beat-up 2-story farmhouse on 7 acres in southern Ohio. They wanted more space for the family. It was way out in the sticks, nearly an hour to the nearest town. Mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I cried and said things like, "Don't like ugly house scary, Mommy don't like." She thought it was weird. For me. But I stopped griping after a couple weeks, so she figured it was just the stress of moving. The place was a wreck, stuck in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was at the back, and up until right before we moved in, it still had an old wood-burning stove against the rear wall. That stove had caught fire a few months earlier, torching the back wall and doing a ton of damage. A lot of it wasn't fixed, so my young parents scored a dirt-cheap lease. Upstairs, right above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord said it had been hit hard by the fire, though her son, who'd done the repairs, claimed the only real damage left was in the kitchen, where it had been worse and beyond his skills to fix. Either way, the landlord was dead set that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I know all this because I grew up hearing stories about that run-down farmhouse with its creepy locked door. We've got photos of us in and around it too. The locked door was right by the upstairs staircase, so you couldn't miss it. Both my parents said it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, Mom and I were out in the yard with our half-Doberman mutt, Rex. She was hanging laundry and I was tumbling around with the dog. She said it hit her all at once that things were too quiet. Then Rex went nuts, barking his head off. From way out, about 500 yards to the left of the house, there was a little duck pond. Rex bolted halfway between us and the pond, then back, to Mom, then toward the water again, barking the whole time. She spotted something thrashing in the middle of the pond and ran over. Rex beat her there and dragged me out of the water, thank God. Mom couldn't figure out how I'd gotten that far that fast, or how I'd made it to the middle since it was over my head and I didn't know how to swim. She thought she'd underestimated me and hauled out baby gates and a playpen after that. From then on, I'd be stuck in it. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Rex was outside, Milo was napping in his crib, and I was in my playpen upstairs. I had a gate on the door and another at the top of the stairs. The staircase ran up from the side of the kitchen, so Mom could hear us if we cried or got rowdy while she cooked. She said it wasn't more than 15 minutes since she'd last checked on us when Rex started going ballistic in the yard again. She ran upstairs to check. Milo was still asleep. All the baby gates were shut and locked, but I was gone. A frantic search turned up nothing. I wasn't in the house. Then the memory of Rex pulling me from the pond hit her, and she rushed outside to see what he'd been trying to tell her this whole time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking nonstop. When she stepped out, he took off to the right, away from the pond, running ahead, then doubling back, barking at her, to follow. Waiting for her to catch up a bit before darting off again, he led her nearly 1.5 miles down a dirt road that separated our place from the neighbors. He took her to a thick patch of woods on their side of the rocky path. Mom said the first thing that hit her was the stench, like rotting hay. She pushed through the brush, her heart pounding and her stomach churning. She said she noticed piles of thin, rippled tarps, old tires, and random junk scattered around. The smell got worse near a scrap pile. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she found the badly decomposed carcass of a butchered cow. As she went deeper into the dense trees, she said the cover got sloppier. Chunks of bone and rotting logs were strewn around. It was obvious our neighbor was illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the bodies in one of the few thick wood patches out there. Probably to dodge taxes or something. And there I was, right in the middle of it, just standing there looking around like I was confused to be surrounded by all that carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing there. She raced over, checked me for injuries, and started firing questions. Why was I there? How'd I get there? Keep in mind, even though Mom said I started talking early, I didn't have much of a vocabulary yet. She said I looked at her with that dead serious expression only a kid can pull off, and told her the kids brought me here. She nearly lost it thinking about anyone, even kids, slipping past her in the kitchen, grabbing me from upstairs and walking me right back past her on the way out without her noticing. She demanded to know what kids, where they were. I gave her that same serious look and said, "The ones who live with us in the room at the top of the stairs." I wouldn't say anything else after that. She said no matter how much she asked, I just stood there, staring at her with that stern face, lips sealed. That pattern held every time she brought it up later, too. She'd always wonder about it and pushed my dad to move us closer to town, right after. The pond incident was unlikely, but at least remotely possible. But Mom's dead certain there's no way I could have ended up in that hidden slaughter patch that day. She said there's no chance I knew it was out there, let alone got the baby gates open and locked them again, slipped down the stairs past her, and made it almost 2 miles down the road to that spot in under 15 minutes. I was 2, slow and clumsy like most toddlers. Like I said, she's still shaken 30 years later. Me, I don't know what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis, but haven't pulled the trigger. Part of me wants to remember, but maybe it's better left a mystery. Whatever those things were, I really don't think they were kids. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. He used to tell it when we'd go camping, and it scared the hell out of me every time. We lived in Utah, and my uncle, Theo, went on a mission when he was 19. They sent him to a Native American reservation in Arizona and paired him up with a companion named Jonas. When they first got there, things were tense with the locals right off the bat. The people on the reservation didn't want Theo and Jonas staying on the grounds. After some back and forth, they worked out a deal to let them crash on the outskirts in a trailer. The reservation wasn't huge, and it sat next to a thick, wooded area. The very first night they tried to sleep, the trailer started shaking hard, rocking back and forth like crazy. Startled and unsure what was happening, they ducked under the table for cover. Theo could hear something pushing it from both sides, like a group of people were out there. It went on for about 5 minutes before it stopped. The next day, they walked around the reservation, chatting with folks. Jonas mentioned to one family that their trailer had shaken the night before. The family got real quiet, then told them they needed to leave. Theo and Jonas thought it was odd but didn't dwell on it. The next night it happened again. They woke up to the trailer rocking side to side. They hid under the table until it quit. It kept up for 2 more nights after that. Anytime they tried talking to anyone about it, people clammed up and told them to get out. Theo started thinking the locals were doing it to scare them off, some kind of hazing for outsiders. Then they stopped by a convenience store, griping to each other about how fed up they were with the whole situation. The clerk overheard them and said they couldn't talk about it, that it was forbidden. When they pressed him, asking what he meant, he started whispering about skinwalkers. He said they were evil spirits, former native witches, and if you talked about them, they'd come for your soul. Theo and Jonas just walked out, confused. figuring it was another scare tactic. That night, when the shaking kicked up again, Theo decided he'd had enough. He was going to face whatever was out there. He marched to the trailer door, flung it open, and yelled into the dark. As he did, he saw 3 things take off running. 2 looked like wolves, and 1 like a bear, but they were off. They had human-like features, weirdly twisted. As he watched them bolt toward the trees, all 3 stood up on 2 legs and walked slow, letting out this creepy, chuckling laugh like a man's voice. It freaked him out so bad that he and Jonas called their mission president the next morning and begged to be reassigned. They got moved out that same day. For a year, nothing else happened. Then one day they got word that Jonas was being sent to a different city, and Theo was getting a new companion, Miles. They had to drive about an hour to pick Miles up from the airport. The route took them along the edge of that same reservation. They got there around 8 p.m., met Miles, and were gearing up to head out. The mission president warned Miles that they'd be driving through a dangerous area at night, so they couldn't stop. "If you need the bathroom, go now," he said. Miles brushed it off, saying he was fine. The president got dead serious, almost panicked, and told Theo, "I'm not kidding, make him go." Miles kept insisting he was good, so they hit the road. About 30 minutes in, cutting through the reservation's border, Miles started complaining. He had to pee bad. The president said, "We can't stop here, you'll have to hold it." Miles wouldn't let up, saying he couldn't wait, so the president finally pulled over. "Fine," he said, "but you do your business right by the door. If I say get in, you get in fast." Miles, looking confused, agreed. He opened the door and started going. 5 seconds later, the president didn't say a word, just yanked Miles back into the car and floored it. Miles and Theo freaked out, yelling, "What's going on?" The president didn't answer, just sped up. Then Theo saw it. Out the right side of the car, this huge wolf-like man was running on 2 legs, keeping pace with them. Theo checked the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and climbing. That wolf thing stayed right beside them for 10 minutes before it finally veered off into the trees. When they got to their destination, Miles was shaking as he climbed out, stammering, "What the hell did I just see?" The president shot back, "Next time I tell you to take care of business, you take care of it." They didn't say another word about it the whole way. I swear to my family this is true. My granddad owns a ranch about 25 miles east of Payson, Arizona. For folks familiar with the area, it's between Hiley Creek and the 260s, real remote, but decent land for grazing cattle. I spend a lot of time out there tending to our Jersey herd. Every night one of us rides out to check on the cows in the pasture and make sure the fences don't have any gaps. A few days back, I headed out on horseback around 1:30 a.m. to do the rounds. I kept hearing rustling in the tree line along the fence. I figured it was a coyote or a squirrel. I see plenty of those out here. The noise would stop every 10 or 15 minutes, then pick up again. The second time it started, I hopped off my horse, a sturdy gelding named Dusty, and led him over to a small water trough. The herd was about 150 to 200 yards off, still in sight under the moonlight. I heard the rustling again, but this time it was heavier. Dusty and I both perked up, wondering what we were picking up on. It hit me as odd that whatever was out there seemed to be watching me. Dusty didn't give a damn about the cows, so to scare it off, I turned back to him, grabbed my whip, and unhooked it. I don't use it on animals, just snap it to make a loud crack for herding cattle. I gave it a few good snaps instead of firing my pistol. The rustling stopped, and the woods went quiet again. I didn't think much more of it. Turned back to count the herd, marked 38 heads, all accounted for, and started riding back to the house. It's about 3.5 miles, part of it along a trail. Things were silent for maybe 10 minutes until I heard that rustling again. Now I was getting pissed, thinking it was some dumb coyote that figured we'd lead it somewhere. I called. My granddad Amos on the radio, no cell service out there, and told him I was going to fire a shot so he wouldn't worry. I reached down and pulled my pistol from its holster. For any gun nuts out there, it's a replica of a Colt .45 Peacemaker, loaded and ready. I fired one round into the air. The sound echoed through the forest and hills, my ears ringing as the smell of gunpowder filled my nose and the smoke cleared. After I calmed Dusty down, I started riding back. Barely 5 minutes later, the rustling picked up again. I was genuinely rattled now. Coyotes usually bolt when they hear a loud bang like that. I didn't have a flashlight because I'm an idiot and forgot it, so I pulled out my lousy iPhone flashlight instead. I slid off Dusty and crept toward the tree line where the noise was coming from, pistol drawn, ready in case something lunged at me. I swung the light across the clearing in the woods. To my right, about 100 feet off, I heard more rustling. I whipped around and froze, half stunned, half confused, as I caught a black shape, a horse, darting across the trail. My first thought was one of ours or maybe a neighbor's had gotten loose. I climbed back on Dusty and rode over to where I'd seen it, shaking with nerves. I couldn't figure out why a horse would be running out here through woods this thick with brush and thorns. When I glanced back to start heading home, I stopped dead, a chill running through me. I dropped my gun. It hit the ground with a thud that echoed through the trees. About 50 feet ahead stood the silhouette of a man wearing a flat-brimmed hat and what looked like leather pants. I scrambled to pick up my pistol, aimed it at the figure, and it was gone. Just vanished. I spun back to Dusty, mounted up, and rode like hell to get out of there, looking over my shoulder the whole time, terrified it'd follow me. I made it back and told Amos everything. He tried to calm me down, saying he'd had some weird run-ins out there too. Many years ago, I lived just outside Buffalo, New York, on one of the oldest estates along Lake Erie's shore. I'd rented the carriage house of an old mansion owned by a doctor and his wife. The doctor, a heart surgeon named Victor, and his wife Lena were pretty well off with property scattered around, so they weren't at the main house much. I loved the solitude of the place, especially since I'd just gone through a divorce. The carriage house was a bit run down, but I liked it. The mansion overlooked the lake, and my little spot was near the private driveway that stretched across the estate. Back in the early 20th century, the carriage house had been quarters for the servants of whoever lived in the mansion. Outside, my door was an enclosed courtyard, framed by the back of my place, the old carriage barn where they used to keep the horse-drawn rigs, a row of empty horse stalls, and a brick wall with an archway leading in. It was a cool spot to live, cheap. Rent a private 150-foot beach I had pretty much to myself. But it was isolated as hell when no one was at the mansion. No close neighbors either, since all the homes along the roads were big estates. A lot of the rich folks in the area weren't full-time residents. Still, I was young, fearless, and into weird stuff, so I was thrilled to find this big, spooky estate all to myself. One night I was driving home late, around 1 a.m., from a friend's place. About a mile or two from my house, I spotted a dark figure standing near the road. It struck me as strange since it was a weeknight, not exactly party hours in Buffalo's South towns. I got a little nervous. The person was just standing there like they were waiting for a ride. As I got closer, I could make out they were wearing this odd black shroud, long and dark, with part of it draped over their head like a hood. It reminded me of an abaya or hijab, but looser, more like a pile of fabric wrapped around them. It didn't fit what I knew about the people in that area. Nobody dressed like that. especially not out in the open at 1 a.m. on a random weekday. They were just standing by the roadside, head down, next to an old car. I slowed down as I approached, worried they might need help. Maybe it was some older lady stranded. But when I got close enough to really see, she lifted her head and looked at me. It was my ex-mother-in-law, Miriam. I was dead certain it was her. The gray-brown hair, those eyes, that cryptic smile that always made me wonder what she was thinking but never saying. She raised her hand and waved. Not a stop and help me wave, but a casual nice to see you kind of wave. It scared the crap out of me. Miriam had been dead for 3 years. I was driving along, hands shaking on the wheel. But after a few minutes and some deep breaths, I told myself I had to go back and look again. She'd loved me. I couldn't picture her showing up to haunt me over divorcing her son, who hadn't treated me well, to say the least. I looped around the block, turning left and coming back down the same road, but no one was there. I was too freaked out to head straight back to my creepy carriage house, with its odd noises and 100-year history, alone with whatever ghosts I was now sure lived there. So I drove to an all-night Greek diner instead, sat there for an hour sipping coffee and tried to calm my nerves. When I finally pulled back into the courtyard at home, I could tell something was wrong. My door was wide open, the glass window shattered, and the wood split nearly in half from side to side. Someone had busted in. The next day I found a crowbar tossed aside in the yard. The only things I noticed missing were a few pieces of my clothing, a jar of loose change, and a kitchen knife. I'd just gotten divorced and wasn't exactly rolling in cash. I didn't have much worth stealing. It was terrifying to think someone had broken into my place out there all alone. They must have driven right into the courtyard and stayed out of sight while they smashed the door. I called the cops, but they never caught anyone. With all the chaos of the break-in, it wasn't until hours later that I remembered seeing my dead ex-mother-in-law waving at me from the roadside, dressed like the Grim Reaper. I'm convinced somehow she showed up to delay me getting home. If I'd driven straight back to the carriage house, whoever, or whatever, split that solid 100-year-old wooden door almost in two with a crowbar might have been waiting for me. Or I could have caught them in the act and things might have gone a lot differently. Maybe real bad for me. Nowadays I write horror fiction. I've even got a ghost novel under my belt. But this story? It's 100% real life. I swear on Miriam's grave it happened. You could even say seeing her by the road that night is part of why I started writing scary stuff. So, my advice? Treat your mother-in-law right. She might just save you, even after she's gone. When I was 19, I hit a wall with dating. It was during my college years, and between school and work I couldn't muster much effort to meet new people or build relationships. I'm a woman, by the way. My best friend at the time had just gotten married and was done with the dating scene entirely. She decided that the next best thing would be to help me find the right guy. Honestly, I wasn't interested in dating back then. I just wanted to get my basics done and transfer to a bigger university. But she insisted I give her a chance. She asked if it'd be okay if she gave this guy my phone number. I was wary and refused at first until she started begging. She went on and on about how handsome he was, how he was 25 and had a stable life. She told me about his high-paying job, the house he'd built himself, the farm he owned, and the horses he kept. She painted him as this sensitive, thoughtful, charming, put-together man. But I knew nobody's that perfect, so I asked, "Okay, what's the catch?" She said, "He only has one leg." That alone wasn't the issue, until she added, "He accidentally shot himself in the foot, and they had to amputate it." I stared at her like she'd just said the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. I told her I didn't think I wanted to date someone who handled guns so badly they blew their own foot off. But after all her pleading and begging, I caved, and she set us up to start talking. I don't remember his real name, so let's call him Marcus. The first few days of texting were pretty decent. He was charming, funny, and kept the conversation flowing easily. He had this slightly cocky, braggy tone, but I let it slide. I mean, if I had my own house and a high-paying job at 25, I'd probably be a little smug too. He made a couple of comments that raised warning flags, though. Like when we talked about meeting in person, he said he wanted to wait a while first. And before we met, he wanted to see me in public, but not like I'd see him too. He wanted me to go somewhere, public, where he could watch me without me knowing he was there. That was creepy as hell. I told myself I'd gotten too deep into this and still wanted to give him a chance, but by the third day, specifically that night, things took a turn. He suddenly decided things weren't moving fast enough. He started asking inappropriate questions. What was my sexual experience? What was my deepest, darkest kink? Had I ever masturbated? I told him I was uncomfortable with that since we'd only known each other for 3 days. He backed off, apologized, and then started guilt-tripping me, something I didn't really notice at the time. He said manipulative stuff like, "I didn't mean it like that. I just want you to trust me. I don't want our relationship to be casual. I want us to be open with each other. I want to be the only one you trust with your fears on a night like this." And I was dumb enough to tell him one of my deepest, darkest kinks, something I've never told anyone and never will, not even naming it in this story. He immediately acted all sympathetic, assuring me he felt the same way while pushing me to go into more detail. I instantly regretted it and tried to change the subject. He kept circling back to it, and I explained I wasn't comfortable, that I shouldn't have told him because it was too soon. I said I wanted to take things slow. He agreed, and we switched topics. We started talking about his house and farm, and I asked him to send pictures of the house since he'd built it himself. He immediately sent photo after photo, his house, his farm, all his horses. For a while it was just pictures, no texts, one after another. Then among the shots of the house, the horses, the fence, the yard, bam, a picture of a giant erect penis. I cut him off with a, "What the hell?" He asked if I liked it, and I fired back with a huge no. I tried to explain how inappropriate it was and asked why he thought sending that was okay when it had nothing to do with what we were talking about. He got annoyed and said, "Damn, calm down, don't freak out. It's not even mine, sorry." Not his. Then whose was it? I kept getting angrier, and we fought. I reached out to my friend who'd set us up and told her what happened. She said Marcus had contacted her too, calling me a bitch and saying I was unhinged. My friend agreed we should just ignore him and drop it. That totally set him off. He started threatening not just me but her too, saying he'd kill us, our families, that we'd be sorry, all that crap. We ignored it at first, until he started reciting our freaking home addresses to us. That got our attention. I asked my friend how exactly she knew him, and she admitted she'd lied. She didn't really know him that well. She used to work at an FYE in the local mall, and apparently this psycho was a customer who'd stopped by. One day she randomly asked if he was single and if he'd be interested in me. I lost it. She didn't even really know this guy. He shouldn't have even known our last names. And now he was telling us our parents' names, siblings' names, our phone numbers. We immediately took screenshots of everything he'd said and told him if he didn't stop, we'd go to the police. Of course, he kept threatening us. My friend's mom is a secretary for a lawyer, so after reporting Marcus to the authorities and blocking him, we told her mom the situation, and she handled it. I don't have the exact details, but we never heard from him again. Reading this back, it might not sound that scary to you. Retelling it now makes it seem kind of funny, but when a stranger reads your own address to you and threatens your life, it's terrifying. A few days later, I realized I should have known that dick pic wasn't his because the guy in the photo had 2 legs. Marcus only had 1. A guy with someone else's dick pics. Yeah, let's not meet. I've got a restraining order now. We had an iMessage group chat with about 7 friends, including me. One of our friends, let's call her Mara, was the annoying little sister type. She'd pester all of us, but we put up with her. One day, Mara sent us a screenshot from a conversation with her cousin, who was either a high school senior or a college freshman. He told her he'd been scrolling on Tumblr when a post about a case popped up on his feed. He'd gone ahead and shared it with her to show her. Mara was confused because the photo was a random selfie from her Instagram, which she barely used and had set to private. Plus, neither she nor anyone else in our group chat used Tumblr. She asked her cousin for a link to the page. When we browsed through it, we were horrified to find that the Tumblr was flooded with pictures of all 5 girls in our group chat. There were individual posts with captions, photos pulled from our respective Instagram accounts, most of which were private. The more we looked at the page, the creepier it got. It seemed like the account was targeting one specific girl in our group. Let's call her Nadia. About 90% of the photos were of her, mostly taken from her Instagram. There were only a few pics of the rest of us. The page had love poems dedicated to her, sappy captions under her photos like Nadia and her loving parents, and even some pictures pulled from her Facebook, despite her privacy settings being locked down. The Tumblr's owner seemed to be an adult man from a different country than where we lived. He'd occasionally post more personal stuff about himself, like a photo of an ice rink from his childhood neighborhood, or a YouTube link to some self-recorded footage from about 8 years ago that he'd helped produce. The account owner didn't seem to be the same person as the Tumblr's creator, based on my own digging. That guy appeared to be real, though the site's main purpose looked like some kind of shrine to Nadia. There were other random posts too, like old song lyrics from obscure artists, hinting at the owner's age. Some photos were from my own Instagram, like one where my face was zoomed in and cropped from a group shot. The most chilling part was one of the older posts he'd put up. It wasn't just a photo of Nadia snatched from her social media. It was a picture of 2 actual framed photos inside someone's house. The caption for that picture said he'd been following her since 2012. 2012. We stumbled across this Tumblr in 2017. Needless to say, we were all completely shocked and terrified, and we didn't know what to do. Nadia sent an angry message to the owner through some contact link on their page, and shortly after, the whole account got deleted. We were left with no leads. Even though I did some research on my own to try to figure out who this person was, I'm not even sure what we could do from there since we didn't have any evidence left, except for the screenshots we'd taken of the page and an old archived link to the site. Any advice would be appreciated. This whole thing just happened to me, and now I'm sitting in my apartment with all the blinds drawn and the doors locked.